Say hello to your starter Anemo support, Lynette. Yes, I am deliberately ignoring the Anemo Traveler because you should switch off that immediately and join the Dendro MC gang, or else I'm going to gaslight you into thinking that Anemo MC is the most garbage unit in the game. So everyone gets a free Lynette now, and although she isn't the star power of the Anemo cast like a Kazuha or Sucrose are, she fills her role well enough and is enjoyable to play in my opinion. She checks the box for everything that you'd expect from a starter character, almost like a jack of all trades that does just a little bit of everything. As always, this Lynette guide will cover her best artifacts and weapons to general playstyle and team compositions. Without further ado, let's get this guide rolling. Lynette's abilities are very basic to fit the idea of a starter character. Her tap skill will flash her cloak and then send a strike to hit an opponent in front of her for Anemo damage. If you hold her skill, she moves in a shadow state and marks one enemy she makes contact with to deal Anemo damage to when she exits the shadow form. This skill is very similar to Yelan's skill in the sense that it is useful for exploration because you regenerate stamina during Lynette's shadow state, but it can only mark one enemy to attack instead of multiple like Yelan's skill. Regardless if you tap or hold Lynette's skill, it has a 12-second cooldown and will cause her to regenerate 25% of her maximum HP. After regenerating HP, you'll lose 6% of her current HP every second for 4 seconds, which will always result in a net gain in health even if you started off at full health. As a character who just switches in to cast her elemental skill and burst, this is a minuscule detail, but for her C6 playstyle with Anemo Infusion, this opens up some new build options with the new artifact set Marushusei Hunter. Lynette's elemental burst summons her Bogglecat box to deal AoE damage in a small area. Like many other Anemo bursts, if the box comes into contact with another element, it will absorb that element and deal additional hits of damage of that respective element. The Bogglecat box will deal 12 hits of Anemo damage including the initial cast, while the extra elemental attacks from absorbing the element happen 5 times if the element is immediately absorbed upon using the burst. For my audience interested in the theory crafting, the 12 hits of Anemo will only result in 5 swirls due to the internal cooldown of applying Anemo only once every 3 hits. Because of this, you'll see in artifacts that Lynette doesn't focus elemental mastery due to her low swirl count, and also due to the fact that her damage multipliers are actually decent at higher talent levels. A little bit of elemental mastery is of course nice to have on Lynette, but unlike the top tier Anemo characters like Kazuha or Sucrose, she gains no external benefit from building EM aside from swirl damage. Her Ascension talents include a damage bonus for her elemental burst, as well as an attack buff for the party whenever she casts her burst. This attack buff does not scale with Lynette's elemental mastery, but rather with the party's composition. With each unique element you have on the team, the attack buff goes up in 4% intervals from 8% all the way to 20% if you have a team with 4 different elements. While these numbers are small, it is a great way to buff your team alongside some of her artifact options, which we'll cover right now. All of Lynette's artifact options at C0 focus on supporting the team, whether that be through set effects that grant buffs or debuffs, or sets that increase her burst uptime for its team-wide attack percent buff. As an Anemo support, I'm sure most people can predict that the 4-set Viridescent Veneer would be her best support set due to how strong the element Res Shred effect is in Genshin. Unless you have a team that cannot utilize resistant shreds such as a mono Anemo team, or another one of Lynette's teammates are already using the Viridescent Veneer set, then this is the go-to artifact set for most situations. The other generalist set for Lyney is the 4-set Emblem of Severed Fate. Although it doesn't provide direct buffs or debuffs to the team, this set helps with her burst uptime. Lynette has a 70 cost elemental burst and usually builds upwards of 200% energy recharge to ensure that she can use her burst every rotation, so converting all that energy recharge into extra burst damage is fantastic for her. Other support sets aside from the 4-set Viridescent include the 4-set Deepwood Memories specifically for Dendro reactions such as Spread or Hyperbloom, and the 4-set Noblesse Oblige in the case where you don't need the 4-set Viridescent Veneer. Artifact stats usually want energy recharge or attack percent in the Sands, Anemo damage in the Goblet, and crit rate or crit damage in the Circlet. When deciding between an energy recharge and an attack percent Sands, usually if you have an energy recharge sword equipped, it's safe to go attack Sands, but otherwise you'll need to have ER as a main stat. As for the Circlet, it was mentioned before that Lynette doesn't actually get that many swirls with her elemental burst, and a crit build usually performs better at C0. Lynette's substat focus follows the usual DPS standards of energy recharge, crit, attack percent, and elemental mastery. Because of the restrictive energy requirements that Lynette has, her weapons mainly focus on comfortably hitting her energy requirements. As such, the two best weapons for Lynette are Favonius Sword and Sacrificial Sword. Both weapons boast a 61% energy recharge stat at max level and have energy-based passives that get exponentially better the more refinements you have, so pick whichever one has the highest refinement level. The third best sword on Lynette is the new free-to-play sword Fleuve Saint Ferryman that can be obtained through the Fishing Association in Fontaine. At refinement rank 5, the sword has a 45% energy recharge stat and will grant an additional 32% energy recharge for a short period of time after using your skill, which eases the burden of getting tons of energy recharge rolls in your artifact substats. Sapwood Blade is another free-to-play option that serves as the craftable option for players. Although its energy recharge stat is dangerously low compared to the top 3 options, it does have the ability to drop a leaf on the ground that buffs the elemental mastery of your on-field character if they walk over it. Any other sword that has energy recharge as their main stat can also be used on Lynette, but to save some time, we're not going to cover them in depth. Just know that swords like Skyward Blade, Festering Desire, and Skyrider Sword are purely used for their stats and have passives that mean little to nothing for Lynette. Because Lynette is classified as a general Anemo support character, you can really use her in any team that can utilize the Forset Viridescent Veneerer. So, for this team section, I'll outline a couple of team archetypes where I think Lynette shines in the most. First up, we have a Freeze team. Kazuha outclasses every other Anemo support in Freeze with his elemental damage buff, but even characters like Sucrose, who provide almost no value to a Freeze team with her elemental mastery buff, finds ways to be useful, such as building catalysts like the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers. Compared to other Anemo characters, Lynette does get a slight edge in Freeze teams thanks to her inherent attack buff on her elemental burst, which cryo DPS characters can benefit from. In Freeze teams, you're guaranteed to have a free 16% attack buff for the team with Lynette because they consist of 2 cryo characters, 1 hydro character, and Lynette herself. Many cryo characters are viable with each other, and players can pick between Ayaka, Ganyu, Shenhe, Rosaria, Kaya, Diona, Layla, and Chongyun, usually with one as a dedicated cryo damage dealer and the other as a support for energy and buffs. Off-field hydro application is a must-have for Freeze teams, meaning your standard options of Kokomi, Xingqiu, Yelan, or Mona remain unchanged when using Lynette in a Freeze team. Of course, what's a Lynette team section without mention of her brother? Sure, the two don't actually have outstanding synergy, which is a little bit disappointing, but a general Anemo support is always welcome in a mono-element team to swirl and provide Red Shred from the Forset Viridescent Veneerer. The team with the siblings usually pans out to be Linny and Lynette, plus Bennett for buffing and healing, and then a flexible final slot. The flex slot can be a third pyro character such as Xiangling for damage, or C4 Yanfei, Toma, Xinyan, or Deha for defensive support in the form of shielding or resistance to interruption, which is very important for a fragile charge attacker like Linny. However, if you want to maximize the element diversity of the team for Lynette's attack buff, you can always pick a non-pyro shielder such as Kidada, Baizhu, Zhongli, Layla, or Diona. All these options have minimal elemental application, which is a key point to pay attention to since Linny's damage relies on attacking enemies affected by pyro, and too many elemental reactions can remove that pyro aura off of enemies. The great thing about Lynette in Hyperbloom teams is that she can act as a general support to swirl elements around and buff the team, or she can be a dedicated Hyperbloom trigger that swirls Electro to hit Dendro cores. From C0 to C5, players cannot reliably use Lynette as a Hyperbloom trigger and should probably avoid transitioning into an Elemental Mastery build. As such, with C0 Lynette taking the off-field role with her general support build, a Hyperbloom team wants 1 Dendro Applicator, 1 Hydro Applicator, 1 off-field Electro, and Lynette herself. If you have premium Dendro characters like Nahida, Alhaitham, or Baizhu, they can use their normal attacks on-field, and you can use Xingqiu, Yelan, or Kokomi for consistent on-field Hydro application. However, if your Dendro roster is limited to the free-to-play options, which are Dendro MC, Kole, or Yao Yao, you're going to need a character that can stay on-field because these Dendro options are strictly off-field supports. Aside from the Hydro options I already mentioned, characters with Hydro attacks like Child, Ayato, and Barber with Ocean Hued Clam are also viable options. Last but not least, the Electro character is usually Kuki Shinobu or Raiden Shogun due to how consistent their elemental skills are at triggering Hyperblooms. With Lynette C6, she gains Anemo Infusion after casting her skill, which allows her to reliably swirl Electro and hit Dendro cores to create Dendro reactions. She can choose to use EM artifact sets like Gilded Dreams or Flower of Paradise Lost, or even change to a crit sword and an artifact set that complements her crit build like Marushusei Hunter, since it synergizes with the HP drain from her elemental skill. Regardless of which build path you decide to go down, the viable teammates do change slightly due to the nature of Lynette taking the on-field duties. Now, both the Dendro and Hydro slots must be able to apply their respective element off-field. For Dendro characters, pick between Kole, Dendro MC, or Yao Yao for their capability to sustain Dendro application even against multiple targets. For Hydro characters, you're strictly limited to Kokomi, Yulan, and Xingqiu, again because these three have too much consistency with their Hydro application. As for the Electro slot, you actually want to pick a character that doesn't prioritize targeting Dendro cores, so Lynette can maximize the Hyper Blooms that she creates. Beta Official and Yae Miko are the ideal characters for this setup because their abilities have very small hitboxes and often will miss Dendro cores unless an enemy is right on top of one. Otherwise, using Kuki Shinobu again to double down as a dual Hyper Bloom trigger and a healer is also a solid choice if you don't have a Dendro or Hydro healer available for the team. With that, I have nothing else to discuss, so let me know your thoughts, builds, and teams for Lynette down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this guide or thought it was useful, be sure to support both the video and the channel. The goal is 30k by the end of the year, and with your help, we can reach that goal. Other than that, it's the same as always. I'll see y'all in the next one. Peace.